All right, kia koutou. Good morning, everybody. Day 2 of this intriguing variation 1 plan change. Welcome to Smith Hennig & Co. I've only got one thing I think to just note just before we start. Overnight we did receive the summary of agreement schedule from Kate Petticino that she indicated she was going to provide to us yesterday. Just looking at my panelists, everyone's received it? Yeah, okay, so that's in the record, thank you. Other than that, is there anything to start? No. Smith Hennig, over to you. You're familiar with the panel, so I won't do the intros.
Indeed. Morena Kuto, or Daniel Minhinik, Tōku ingoa. In terms of introductions for the Tauriko Crossing team, so with me I have Ms. Boyster to my left, and then as far as the various witnesses, to my right, Mr. Arbuthnot, Akehurst and Hughes. So you have before you statements of evidence from each of those 3 witnesses, along with some written submissions that have been filed. As this has evolved and to reflect sort of where things are at today, do intend that I will speak to, as well as my submissions, some brief supplementary submissions addressing the key issues of debate between the various parties. And then Mr. Arbuthnot and Mr. Hughes have short summary statements as well, just focusing on those key issues of dispute that they'll focus on. Before they speak, do intend that Mr. Akehurst will very briefly address you on his matters, because those are reasonably well understood, so it'll only be...
Thank you, and I was surprised to see Mr. Akehurst today. I thought he was going to be virtual. He's either holographic or he's not.
So with that, I will turn to my legal submissions, and so I just intend to speak to key points, particularly in the introduction, before going to the supplementary submissions. So these submissions are presented on behalf of Tauriko Crossing. Tauriko Crossing has been in discussions with both the council and Waka Kotahi for a number of years in relation to particularly the transport matters in relation to this area, and it's reflected in its position, which is generally supportive of the provisions as notified, subject to a couple of discrete matters. And in terms of the points that Tauriko Crossing have sought changes to what was proposed, it really focuses on the issues of out-of-sequence development and or development in excess of what has been modelled in the transport upgrade sorted for, and that's where we will focus our case. So in terms of my submissions at 1.3, it is widely accepted that there are significant constraints within the existing transport network and that upgrades are required before urban development within Tauriko West can proceed. It is therefore critical from Tauriko Crossing's perspective that the variation includes a robust planning framework to ensure development in subdivision does not occur out of sequence with the provision of necessary transport upgrades. At 1.4, I do outline those 2 key matters where Tauriko Crossing seeks non-complying activity status. There are some related and consequential changes or associated changes that you would have seen in the evidence of Mr. Arbuthnot, and he will address you briefly on those. In our submission, the evidence before this panel is clear that a non-complying activity status for these activities is entirely appropriate here. This is because subdivision and development in advance of the necessary transport upgrades prescribed in the appendix is not anticipated in Tauriko West. Further, without additional long-term transport upgrades, which are not included within that appendix, there is the potential for subdivision and development to cause significant adverse effects on the surrounding transport network. And then at 1.9, also just address Tauriko Crossing's position as to the size and extent of the local and neighbourhood centres. And so as you would have seen in the evidence of Mr. Akehurst, any increase to the size and scale of these centres from what is notified is inappropriate and inefficient from an economics perspective. Essentially, the size of those centres is already more than large enough.
Sorry, just on that, I think there was a proposal and some evidence to increase it to 1.5 hectares for the stormwater. Was there a position for Tauriko crossing on that?
Yeah, so sorry, so we are comfortable with that change. It's more the submissions from other parties seeking a broader area beyond that. So then in section 2 of my submissions outline the witnesses, and then in 3, those 2 key matters that I address. So turning to the question of the transport related provisions, you would have seen from Mr. Hughes's evidence the issues as far as the transport network as it exists and the issues in terms of outer sequence development. I've outlined those in 4.1, but we'll leave Mr. Hughes to take you through that in more detail. But do make the point that this is a widely accepted position and that there doesn't seem to be dispute about the extent of the current issue. It's more about how important is it that development needs to follow those upgrades. 4.3, as set out by Mr. Arbuthnot, the residential growth that is enabled by Variation 1 is clearly premised on significant transport upgrades being in place and operational prior to development occurring. None of the analysis supporting Variation 1 anticipates development occurring within the area without the completion of the relevant stages for transport upgrades. And so despite that, Tauranga Crossing's concern, as it outlined at 4.4, is the provisions within Variation 1 that still enable subdivision and development not in accordance with that sequencing to be enabled by way of a restricted discretionary activity status, and then subdivision and land use beyond 2,400 allotments or dwellings having discretionary activity status. Now, I think at this point it might be useful if we jump across to my supplementary notes, and I'll just speak to these really because following my submissions, the council and Kaimoora have also exchanged submissions at the same time, and so these really focus on those key issues of dispute there. So the council's position is that a less restrictive activity status still achieves the relevant objectives and meets the requirements of section 32. Council's legal submissions state that the proposed policy and rule framework appropriately provides for assessment and management of transport effects without needing the further restrictions of the 104D gateway tests. Kaimoora makes similar arguments in its legal submissions. It is generally accepted that a non-complying activity status provides for increased scrutiny and that is generally regarded as being a more restrictive pathway to consent. This additional scrutiny and more restrictive pathway is entirely appropriate where an activity is not anticipated by the plan or may have significant adverse effects, both of which in my submission are the case here. This is reflected in the quote from East West Link that was contained in my legal submissions. Now, my friend for the council suggested that that quote wasn't relevant and was simply reflecting the wording in the AUP. In my submission, it was reflecting the accepted position at law, and it is also reflected within the council's own plan in the sense that the plan section 1A also describes a non-complying activity as one which is generally not anticipated in the zone as well. So it doesn't address the significant adverse effect aspect, but certainly the not anticipated bit is accepted within the plan here as well. But in my submission, that quote from East West Link at 15 does reflect in my submission a statement as to the general position as to what non-complying activities are.
What's your submission in response to the position that was put before us yesterday about it being well-settled law that the correct approach to determining activity status is that the least restrictive should be adopted?
Certainly. All other things being equal, I would accept that. However, that is taking it as just that sentence is reflecting the position at law is overly simplistic in my submission, and that there are additional nuances as far as there can be other reasons why a more onerous activity status is most appropriate. And so in my submission, it still comes down to that consideration under section 32 of what is most appropriate. There are questions about efficiency and effectiveness. And so if you go, there are two activity statuses that are both equally effective, the less restrictive activity status will be more efficient. And so that makes sense, but there can be a range of reasons as far as what generates effectiveness. And so I think that's actually where the difference is about what is required for the activity status here to be effective. And so that's where I think the difference between the parties may well sit, because if you are saying there are, as I understand the position for the council and Kaingaora, they're saying essentially the restricted discretionary activity status is equally effective, and so therefore the least restrictive activity status should apply.
So in your view, that it's not possible to fashion matters of discretion that would be equally effective under a restricted activity status?
So it would go to, and Mr. Arbuthnot will address this as well, what the objective and policy framework outlines and how directive they are. Because the concern from my client's perspective is that unless you have a clear direction within the objective and policy framework, and then that's also carried through into the other provisions, and RD status alone won't necessarily provide that sufficient protection.
So in your primary legal submissions, I think you make the statement that non-compliant status is the only appropriate way to achieve the sustainable purpose, management purpose of the Act. So in your view, there is no way that the rules and policy framework could be amended to be strengthened, so you've got more directive policies supported by restricted discretionary framework. It's the only way, not non-compliant.
That is reflective, and I think it's a matter that Mr. Arbuthnot can address you on, because he is the one who has been carefully working through those provisions with the other planners as well. I think that is something that he can address you on, but that is certainly our position, is that non-complying, definitely in terms of what is most appropriate, that it is clearly in our in my submission the most appropriate here.
Just to round that out, in your submissions, there's a number of statements about what's anticipated within the zone. Clearly, residential development is anticipated within the zone. It seems as if it's the effects or potential effects of that development. I'm just wanting to, that is of concern to your client, just wanting to be really clear. Are you saying that what is the activity that you are saying is not anticipated within that? Is that the beyond the 2,400 without transport upgrades? You're not saying that residential development beyond that is not anticipated, are you?
So, absolutely, we're not saying residential development per se. It is very much that out of sequence development. And so if we focus firstly on the question of development within that 2,400, but in occurring before the necessary or without the necessary transport upgrades, in our submission, that is clearly not anticipated by the plan. In terms of development beyond that, the challenge is that the assessment hasn't been undertaken of exactly what the upgrades are. All the evidence points towards State Highway 29 improvements being critical to enable that to occur, but there's nothing within the schedules that, or the appendix that references that, and it seems perverse, if you accept my original submission, that development within the 2,400 that's out of sequence is not anticipated and should be non-complying. It then seems bizarre that in the absence of detailed modelling and the schedule addressing the necessary upgrade beyond 2,400, that there should be a more favourable activity status as well. But it's not about residential development per se, it is that out of sequence issue, that is the pure concern here. And so returning to my supplementary notes, given the fundamental nature of the transport upgrades, TCL would be concerned if any party is suggesting that out of sequence development, for example, is anticipated at Tauriko West. Our position is that that should be discouraged. Non-complying activity status sends that message. I also make the point at 5 that, taken to its logical conclusion, the argument for the council and Kaingaora would mean that non-complying activity status could never be justified in any context. Essentially going, because restricted discretionary or full discretionary gives the ability for all effects to be considered and for consent to be declined, end of story, the least restricted activity status must apply. Where does there end up being a situation where in any context non-complying activity status would be appropriate?
That, of course, was the point that we reached with the previous overturned legislation, of course. Yeah, that isn't currently the case. Yeah.
At 6, make the point that Mr. Arbuthnot has undertaken that Section 32 assessment and that his position remains that non-complying activity status to be most appropriate, it should be for the reasons outlined in his evidence. So over the page, with respect to out-of-sequence development, the objective of variation 1 is directive, requiring that subdivision and development be in accordance with staging and sequencing of planned and constructed infrastructure. Mr. Arbuthnot considers this as enabling only a very limited and small-scale changes to the staging and sequencing requirements, and a non-complying activity status gives effect to this directive wording. Non-complying activity status seeks to better ensure that out-of-sequence development does not occur, and that is critical for managing those potentially significant adverse effects. And a non-complying activity status provides greater scrutiny during the resource consent process, and that is appropriate. Mr. Matheson yesterday, I understand, gave the example of consent occurring earlier so that construction could essentially occur in tandem with the construction of any transport upgrades. Now, my submission, there is still within the non-complying activity status, that's not saying that's not prohibited. And so to the extent that you're going immediately before and it's being coordinated still with that transport upgrade, there is still the ability for consent to be granted for non-complying activity. And so again, it's those kind of exceptions are what non-compliant activity status can still achieve. But it is, as a general rule, suggesting that it isn't anticipated that something that is wildly out of sequence should be allowed to occur. And then for subdivision and development above 2,400 allotments, as notified, variation 1 only anticipates up to 2,400 residential allotments, and the long-term development beyond this threshold relies on additional upgrades. And delivery of that State Highway 29 upgrade is currently uncertain. There's been no modelling undertaken to determine the significance of the adverse effects. However, the uncontested evidence before this panel is that the transport network is constrained and an upgrade of State Highway 29 is required before development above that threshold can be enabled. And so for those reasons, in my submission, it is entirely appropriate that development above that level also be subject to greater scrutiny through non-complying activity status. Then, just returning to my original submissions, the final point at 5 related to local and neighbourhood centres. As conveyed, TCL's concern is with those submissions made by other parties seeking to expand the extent of those centres or the local centre. In our submission, The overwhelming weight of evidence before the panel does not support the amendment requested by Tauriko West, and that the size and scale of the local and neighbourhood centres, as notified, subject to that 0.1 hectare difference, are already larger than necessary from an economics perspective. And if the centres are sized beyond what is required, that could attract various further transport effects, which are also of concern. So those are the points that I wish to address you on. Happy to take any further questions at this point, otherwise we'll get them to the witnesses.
I'm not sure whether you had the opportunity to listen to the counsel for Tauriko property west yesterday, but she made submissions around Wakanai and scope and jurisdiction, and in her legal written submissions at para 38, she says, and she's referencing the relief sought by Tauranga Crossing, these legal constraints on to an IPI impact on the IHP's discretion in considering relief and recommending changes to the variation as sought by Tauranga Crossing in relation to seeking a development constraint based on delivery of transport infrastructure and a non-complying activity status. And then she also talks about the PTs. So she seems to be raising a jurisdictional issue with the relief that Tauranga Crossing's seeking. Could you respond to that?
Yeah, certainly. It's one a number of the commissioners will be experienced in the IPI processes around the country. Transport constraints have been an accepted qualifying matter. There are other examples of areas where, because of transport constraints, there have been limits placed. One example might be in the various Drury plan changes, where there are a series of major transport upgrades required to enable development to occur, and so there are clear qualifying matters. So to the extent there's any concern from that perspective here, given the significant constraints that are in place in this transport network already existing, there is a clear basis, and so from my submission there shouldn't be any concern in terms of a jurisdictional scope basis.
Thank you, Mr. Hank, your first witness. Thank you.
Excellent. We'll get Mr. Akers to very briefly address you.
Good morning. I really only have one thing to add to my evidence, and that concerns Tauriko West Limited's request to extend the local centre land area from 1.4/1.5 hectares to 2 hectares in total area, and that is in Mr. Craig Batchelor's evidence to allow accommodation of larger footprint commercial activities such as medical centres and preschools, as outlined in para 45 of his evidence in chief, and also para 13 of his rebuttal evidence. I'd just like to draw to the panel's attention that those activities are already accounted for within the 1.4 hectares. If you look in Appendix A to the Section 32 analysis, the report by Property Economics, on page 24, Tim Heath lists the examples of convenience commercial service activities that could locate in the centre, and within that he lists doctors, physiotherapists, medical practitioners, dentists and childcare facilities, and they form part of the total non-retail commercial service land requirements listed in Table 6 on page 22. So they're already accounted for, and there is no requirement to allow for additional land to cater for those activities. Happy to answer any questions on that or my evidence.
No, that's helpful. Thank you for that.
Just one from me. In 412 of your evidence in chief, you're discussing the fact that you don't believe that a supermarket is appropriate in that location because it would draw people in from outside. What population would you normally look at for a full service supermarket, 3,000 square metre supermarket?
I'm sorry, I don't have those figures on the top of my head. My issue with the 3,000 square metre supermarket is that it's justified in Mr. Heath's evidence on the basis of a catchment that extends significantly beyond the local area, and that's reported in appendix 2 of his report on page 28, and he's got the green area shaded where he's saying that a supermarket in the local centre would draw from. To my mind, that is completely inappropriate for a local centre. That should be the catchment map for a sub-regional centre supermarket, which should be Tauriko Crossing, not Tauriko West.
And just showing my lack of knowledge of what is at Tauriko Crossing, having been in the car park but not in the building. Is there a supermarket there at the Tauriko Crossing at the moment?
Yes, there's a large pack and save, and I think they've got consented countdown as well, so there'll be 2 significant full service supermarkets.
Thank you.
Just picking up the reference that you made to Mr. Heath's 32 appendix. Is it the case that convenience, commercial or professional service activities as he's listed there, are they defined as such or categorized as such in the plan? So is this an accepted suite of activities that could occur, or is it simply a background to his formation of the size?
I would imagine it is the latter. I'm not aware that the plan defines those activities, but these are generally accepted as non-retail commercial activities located in centres, absolutely.
All right, thank you, Mr. Akehurst.
Thank you. So we'll now move on to Mr. Hughes, who does have a brief hearing statement or summary statement that you should have copies of.
Mr. Hughes.
Good morning. I'll just read this out, it's relatively brief. My full name is Darrell Hughes and I'm an Associate Transportation Engineer at CKL, providing evidence on behalf of Tauriko Crossing. I prepared evidence on the 20th of November and I confirm the qualifications experience outlined are correct, and I confirm my commitment to the Environment Court Code of Conduct. As I set out in my evidence in chief, I consider that the existing Tauriko transport network is under severe pressure, with high delays and long queues evident throughout the network during peak periods. These conditions will continue to worsen once the first stage of Tauriko West development occurs. That's up to 2,400 residential allotments. Even if the required stage 1 enabling works as set out in Appendix 12I.1 are in place. Beyond stage 1, and therefore above 2,400 IDUs, new State Highway 29 offline upgrade is required to support the additional generated traffic. No modelling has been undertaken to assess the effect of further development beyond 2,400 dwellings should the necessary State Highway 29 upgrade not be provided. As such, the effects of not providing the upgrade are unknown, although I consider it as a logical assumption that the development above 2,400 residential allotments without the State Highway 29 upgrade in place will cause significant additional congestion throughout the Tauriko network. This is also consistent with the findings in the detailed business case as I set out in my evidence. I also discuss in my evidence in chief why I disagree with submitters requesting a larger local centre within Tauriko West, as I'm concerned with the additional traffic that a larger local centre would generate on an already congested network. In response to rebuttal evidence, I've read the rebuttal evidence of Mr. Richards on behalf of the Tauranga City Council, and I'll respond here. With regards to the ITA, in paragraphs 2.3 to 2.12, Mr. Richards sets out why the preparation of an ITA is the appropriate tool for assessing the effects of the development. I concur that an ITA is the appropriate assessment tool, but also note that an ITA would be required for most activity status options, including non-compliant, discretionary, restricted discretionary, and even permitted. As such, the requirement for an ITA does not imply which activity status would be most appropriate, and I defer to Mr. Arbuthnot on the matter of what is an appropriate activity class. In relation to analysis and evaluation, in paragraphs 213 to 216, Mr. Richards sets out that he considers modelling beyond 2,400 residential allotments without the State Highway 29 upgrade is unnecessary and would add little value, because there are too many unknowns in relation to how transport and development trends will change in the future. In my experience supporting major plan changes and developments, it is a common requirement to test short, medium and long-term expected development and traffic scenarios, normally to a 10, 20 and 30-year future horizon. While I agree to an extent that in the longer term, less certainty is available with respect to the predicted adverse effects, modelling the predicted effects on the network is still useful to understand future scenarios and the implications of not providing required infrastructure. Here, it is well accepted that an upgrade of State Highway 29 is required in the future, so modelling demonstrating the potential effects of development without this upgrade would provide an indication of the seriousness of these effects. However, my evidence was not intended to criticise the absence of the traffic modelling in this regard, but to emphasise that in its absence, there is a high level of uncertainty as to the effects of providing development without the required upgrades. And as such, the relevant planning experts should take this into consideration when selecting an appropriate activity status for development that does not comply with the required upgrades. In conclusion, I remain concerned regarding the uncertainties around any development that does not provide the required infrastructure upgrades, as this would most likely lead to significant deterioration in the operation of the Tauriko transport network.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Questions? Fraser?
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. In terms of your supplementary evidence, in your 1.3, you're saying in your second sentence, these conditions will continue to worsen once the first stage of Tauriko West development occurs, even if the stage 1 enabling works is completed or are in place. What do you base that statement on?
So there's been a lot of modelling, a lot of reports and business cases and modelling reports. The one I'm referring to in my primary evidence is the memo that WSP wrote in 2021. And they did a lot of analysis of the entire State Highway 29A corridor. And it showed that, yeah, the stage 1 enabling works, they addressed the very local effect on State Highway 29 as the development sort of contacts immediately, but obviously additional traffic on the rest of the network that isn't treated by those enabling works, yeah, traffic will increase and therefore issues will continue to continue.
So what from what we've read, my understanding was that with the enabling works were completed, then up to 2,400 additional allotments could be could be developed with and meet expected levels of service. But you're saying that's not the case.
On State Highway 29 in the vicinity of the Tauriko West area, those enabling works will address the effects there, but there's wider effects beyond those immediate effects on the wider network that won't be addressed by them. And that's, yeah, it'll just be treated as an increase in background traffic on those externals. So it's more further down the other intersections to the east.
So in your view, do you believe it's adequate that the enabling works are sufficient to provide for the development up to 2,400 residential lots? Or are you saying that shouldn't even occur?
No, I do. I'm comfortable with the enabling works, enabling 2,400. It affects those local effects, and the wider network's just going to have to live with it until the full upgrade comes along. So I'm comfortable with the fact that it does continue to degrade, but that the more severe effects, which are directly adjacent, are addressed.
So addressing the local effects.
Yeah.
And I had a second question in terms of your primary evidence. You made a comment in relation to the impact, and it might be related to what we've just discussed, but whether the work that was envisaged in the enabling works were sufficient. So I think in 513 you've said, talked about no traffic modelling has been undertaken if development occurs ahead of the upgrades outlined in 12L1. Nonetheless, I consider significant adverse effects are likely to result if subdivision or development were to occur within the plain change area ahead of the necessary transport upgrades required in the appendix. And then you go on to say, I therefore consider it's important that a robust planning framework is in place for the subdivision in development, etc., or which exceeds 2,400 development units, IDUs. And I sort of got the impression from reading that you were sort of raising concerns as to whether Appendix L1 was actually addressing the issues associated with the 2,400, up to the 2,400. Have I read that incorrectly?
I think so, or maybe I've written it incorrectly, but the point I was trying to make there was I'm happy with that the enabling works mitigate the effects of the development. I'm just worried about if any of that doesn't, funding gets withdrawn or transferred somewhere else, that if those enabling works aren't built, then the 2,400 shouldn't go ahead. And then the second point is beyond 2,400, if something happens without the state highway 29 upgrade. So yeah, there were 2 points there. But I'm comfortable with what is proposed.
You're comfortable with what?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just 1 point for me, 6.6 in your evidence in chief, you talk the highly conservative approach needs to be undertaken for development beyond 2,400. So, I mean, the plan clearly requires that consideration be given to what further transport upgrades are required beyond 2,000, for development beyond 2,400. So when you talk about highly conservative approach, are you really just talking about activity status there? Because there is it could be said as a conservative approach because you can't go beyond 2,400 already without doing further studies.
Yeah, that is what I'm getting at. I'm just trying to avoid getting beyond that without the mitigation and the death by 1,000 cuts where somebody comes and says, oh, let's do another 50, that'll be fine, and let's do another 20, and just it builds up and builds up from there. There needs to be a really robust ability for council to say, we're drawing the line there, let's not go beyond it unless it's been demonstrated.
Thank you.
I know Mr. Wood from NZTA is coming next, but I just want to take you to your 6.5 in your primary statement and your understanding of where the current process is with respect to stages 2 and 3 of State Highway 29. Any update or any sort of other intelligence on that? When would you expect, I guess, that business case to move forward? Have you got any intelligence on that?
I haven't got any intel on that. As far as I understand, they're going through business cases, and that's all I've got. I don't know if Mr. Ogdenot's got anything beyond what I know on that. No.
That's all right. I'm just flagging to Mr. Wood that you can tell me what the answer is shortly.
I quite often ask the question, and I very rarely get an answer.
Well, that's the advantage of being at this end of the table, isn't it? It's right. Okay.
More than that, just in terms of, so there's the 2 different activities which Tauriko Crossing seeking a non-complying activity status for. One is out of sequence development and the other is beyond the 2,400. In your view, from a traffic perspective, are the scale of effects likely to be similar for both? Are they both individually significant? I note under the council's proposal, they've got one as a restricted discretionary activity and one as a discretionary activity, but Tauriko Crossing seeking non-compliant for both. So from a traffic perspective, are they similar level of, have you got a similar level of concern with both activities and that they're both going to reach significant scale of effects?
Yes, I do. So for the outer sequence, so building the 2-4 without the enabling works, any one of those enabling works that aren't provided, the system's going to break down. There's already issues on State Highway 29 now, quite severe issues, so that's just going to get significantly worse. So And then, yeah, beyond the 2,400, the thing with that is if it's 2,410, I'm not as worried as if it's 4,000, you know what I mean? So there's grades of concern there, but I think, the line has been drawn there and I'm happy with where the line is. So yeah, I'm concerned about both aspects equally.
Just go a little bit further on that one. So you're saying that all of those upgrades that are required in that sequential table, they're all of equal concern?
Certainly, there's the northern and the southern connection, and there's the Cambridge Road upgrade. Those are the absolute critical ones. There's also some other connections and the public transport and all that sort of thing. Probably less concerned. I'm more concerned with those three major connections onto that stretch of State Highway 29.
Right.
Thank you. So the final witness for Tauriko Crossing is Mr. Arbuthnot. Again, you've got a short summary statement that he will take you through.
Morning, everyone. I think I've appeared in front of all of you before, but there maybe one or two in the room that I haven't. My name's Mark Arbuthnot, Director of Bentley & Co. I'm a planning consultant. And then to my summary statement, maybe if I step through that, maybe if I pick it up at 1.3, and that's set out in the evidence of Mr. Hughes. And as we've just been discussing, the existing transport network supporting Tauriko West is constrained, and further development will only exacerbate these issues. And it's my view that it's well accepted that the transport infrastructure upgrades are required to support any level of development within the Tauriko West area. As I set out in my evidence in chief, I do not support the respective restricted discretionary and discretionary activity statuses for subdivision and land use that are not in accordance with the appendix or beyond 2,400 residential allotments or IDUs. Rather, my opinion is a non-compliant activity status is the most appropriate in terms of section 32 of the RMA. And I'll expand on that more in section 2, just as I respond to some of the legal submissions that have been presented as well by council. And so I've also considered that there are amendments to policy 12B131 to provide explicit direction that the delivery of the initial 2,400 residential allotments and/or IDUs is conditional on the delivery of the necessary transport infrastructure upgrades and explicitly prevent development beyond 2,400 residential allotments and IDUs until the long-term infrastructure upgrades are completed. And my view is that without these additional policy requirements, there's potential for varied interpretation and inconsistent implementation, undermining the sequential and integrated approach to development and transport infrastructure that variation 1 is premised on. And there's a gap in the plan's framework, as variation 1 does not account for or contemplate development beyond 2,400 residential allotments or IDUs. And I think there's a question earlier on about alternative approaches. So was there an alternative approach where you could strengthen policies and retain effectively some form of discretionary activity status? I did turn my mind to that in preparing this in my 32 analysis as well. But my view is that the transport upgrades in the short term and the long-term works are of such fundamental importance to the development within the Tauriko West area that you can't decouple the two. My view is that without these upgrades occurring in the right sequence and being completed, and/or development occurring beyond 2,400 without the upgrade of State Highway 29, my view is that the business cases that support Tauriko West are very clear that this development should not be occurring. And I'll step through that in a little bit more detail in my summary statement for you as well. I've also recommended, in terms of policy B of that policy, to require sufficient infrastructure to be available to support the activity. And that was that question about infrastructure ready. In my view, that's more appropriately aligned with the objective, being in mind that the objective is to provide safe, efficient, and functional infrastructure in accordance with the staging and sequencing. So I think that's more appropriately aligned with that and the underpinning analysis of the detailed business cases. And the application of the non-compliant activity status for subdivision development, which is not in accordance with the appendix or beyond 2,400 residential allotments or IDUs, requires consequential changes to a number of other rules. And I've set them out as well in my evidence, appendix 3. So if we just turn to the legal submissions in this issue, the core issue, which is non-compliant versus restricted discretionary activity or discretionary activity status. So I've read the legal submissions filed on behalf of Tauriko City Council, which refer to my planning assessment and recommended non-compliant activity status. So what the legal submissions have done, they've referred to 3 paragraphs of my primary evidence, that's 7.4, 7.6, 7.9. And those are 3 paragraphs really where I'm talking about my experience of when different activity statuses have been applied in district plans, generally across the board and throughout New Zealand. Particularly in respect of non-compliant activities, even when they tend to be employed where where the district plan is trying to discourage or avoid a particular outcome. And they've used that to conclude the recommendations on the non-compliant activity status is inconsistent with the approach usually preferred in the Environment Court. Legal submissions are saying that where the purpose of the RMA and the objectives of the plan can be met by a less restrictive activity status, then it will be likely the most efficient approach for the purpose of Section 32. And I think that's an oversimplistic summary of my evidence. In my view, the reasons set out in the environment in my evidence in chief and assessed below a non-compliant activity status for both out of sequence development and development above 2,400 is appropriate to meet sustainable management purpose of the RMA and the objectives of the plan. It's therefore, my opinion, the most appropriate for the purpose of Section 32. So maybe if I start in terms of the summary of it, I've provided you with both of the detailed business cases and appreciate they were voluminous in terms of the pages and space that built on your hard drive, but I think they're really important because that's the document that gives you where that's 2,400 dwelling limit and where the road and infrastructure staging and sequencing requirements in the appendix are derived from. And those business cases confirm that if you don't appropriately, if not appropriately integrated into the transport system, planned use and development within the Western Corridor generally is unlikely to proceed due to the scale of impacts on access, safety and livability. There are existing safety, access and travel time reliability issues along and across State Highway 26. These issues would likely be exacerbated by inappropriate connection to Tauriko West. In the first stage of development, it has been agreed that 2,000 dwellings can realistically be accommodated given the available transport capacity and surrounding network. This is all from the business cases. To support the ongoing development of housing and business land in the Western Corridor, improve multimodal accessibility, maintain freight access, and address current safety issues, the transport network needs to be modified and enhanced. Without investment to provide multimodal access, development within the Western Corridor could become unviable. With an already congested network, vehicular traffic conditions will continue to deteriorate unacceptably, both through the functional element of the key inter-regional journey, freight for Port of Tauranga, for commercial operators, and for local movements between growth areas, places of work, education, and recreation. Actually, if I pause there, and if I take you maybe to 6.4 of my evidence, there was a question of Mr. Hughes around where am I? The question was around whether or not what the effects of the first stage of development, so the 2,400 units would be on the highway network, even with the networks in place. And if I take you to paragraph 6.7D, and this is from the business case for the Tauriko network connections. And this sets out what the effect is likely to be. And it talks about at Roman numeral 1, the key intersections of Tauriko becoming less functional, with Takatimu Drive, State Highway 36, 29, 29A intersection likely to face approach delays of 16.5 minutes with queue lengths of 1.5 kilometers, and Barks Corner likely to face delays as high as 23 minutes with queue lengths greater than 1.5 kilometers. Now I'll let that sink in a little bit. In fact, Mr. Hughes actually identifies in the transport report, actually it's longer than that in terms of the queue delays. But this is in relation to a key part of the transport network that both regionally and nationally significant infrastructure in the Port of Tauranga, industry and businesses rely on The proposal here with the Tauriko West variation is to add 4,000 dwellings to that mix. And so that's where I'm talking about in terms of thresholds above 2,400, in terms of the significance of the effects that could occur without the long-term upgrades being in place. It's actually already there. It's actually already forms part of the business cases in terms of the explanation of that underpin this whole plan change. I just don't want to lose sight of some of the information that's contained in here. And then maybe if I go back to my summary statement, and apologies for jumping about a little bit, but a 2.4F on page 3, I say that again, while the enabling works may contribute to a greater and safety transport choice from the new Tauriko growth area, and that's what Mr. Hughes was saying in terms of the adequacy to deal with immediate local safety concerns. It caters only for these additional 2,000 households, not the full build out of the UGA, nor the wider Western corridor. And then over the page at G, further transport improvements are required to deliver the full build out of Tauriko West. And so then what my summary statement does then, it's really on my evidence, I suppose, is examining how this plan changes responding to those issues. So what is the framework? What is the signal, I suppose, to the community in terms of the expectations of what has to occur to allow development to proceed within this urban growth area, and how much development can occur at any given time. And that's really what my evidence is trying to grapple with. And so in terms of the out of sequence development to the appendix, I mean, we all know what section 78 of the RMA says, but you have the objectives, you have policies to implement objectives, and you have rules to implement policies. And I think again, it's probably worth maybe just highlighting that. And so if we look at the objective at 2.6, subdivision development in Tauriko West growth area for residential use provides for safe and functional infrastructure and network utilities, and occurs in accordance with staging and sequencing of planned and constructed infrastructure. 2.7, the objective is directive and requires subdivision and development to occur in accordance with the staging and sequencing of planned and constructed infrastructure. My opinion is that the term in accordance is enabling of only very limited and small scale changes to the staging and sequencing requirements that do not require extensive re-evaluation of the effects. And I think this comes back to Mr. Mahinnick's earlier comment in response to Kangaora around non-compliant activity status can still allow consents to be granted. And to my mind, it's working around those sorts of circumstances where they're minor and you don't have to undertake an extensive re-evaluation of the effects. And I further note that policy 12A122 of the city plan provides for the coordinated and sequenced delivery of efficient, effective, functional and sustainable infrastructure and services through the subdivision process by ensuring the provision of infrastructure through the subdivision of land in urban growth areas proceeds in a sequence consistent with the relevant urban growth plan while installing new infrastructure in a coordinated and logical manner. So again, this policy to my mind is equally directive. And my view is that it's essential that the planning framework recognises that the implementation of the enabling works and long-term transport works are inextricably linked to the development of Tauriko West. Council's legal submissions advise that the activity status is required to be selected by determining the most appropriate statutory regime that where the purpose of the RMA and the objectives of a plan change can be met by a less restrictive activity status, then that will be that will likely be the most efficient approach for the purposes of section 32. Detailed business cases clearly demonstrate the significant adverse effects that could arise from the absence of the required transport infrastructure to support development in Tauriko West UGA. The non-compliant activity status implements the directive objectives and policies of the city plan, and I remain of the opinion that it's the most efficient approach for achieving the purpose of section 32. In terms of development beyond 2,400 residential allotments, similarly to Tauriko network connections detailed business cases clear that the enabling works cater only for the first 2,000 households and further transport improvements are required to deliver for the full build out. Mr. Hughes, and this is without repeating myself, Mr. Hughes has also identified that earlier comment that I made around transport delays around the state highway network it's actually more like 20 minutes and 33 minutes, not 16 and a half minutes and 23 minutes. 23 minutes. Either way, both the detailed business cases are clear that further development of Tauriko West, if not appropriately integrated into the transport system, is unlikely to proceed due to the scale of the impacts on access, safety and livability. And I would add to that, I suppose, as well, that where in the plan, in this plan change, does it provide for, what guidance does it give you in terms of how to achieve that full build out? And my view is that it's largely absent of it, other than just managing the adverse effects around a few intersections. It doesn't actually tell you as a reader or set an expectation that there are broader upgrades required to the state highway network. They're required before you can exceed that 2,400 threshold. Not explicitly anyway. And I think that needs to be provided. So in this context, I'm of the opinion that non-compliant activity status is the most appropriate way to signal that subdivision development proposals in Tauriko West above 2,400 residential allotments will be subject to greater scrutiny and absent essential transport infrastructure are less likely to be appropriate. The non-compliant activity status enables greater scrutiny through requiring assessment under section 104D.
Just one point for me, just picking up on that last part of your summary that you just ran through there. So 212A, you say the business case talks about the first 2,000 households. How do we get to 2,400?
It's a great question. I think Becca undertook some additional transport modelling and basically which demonstrated the difference between 2,000 and 2,400 dwellings was effectively wasn't that significant, and so it proceeded to 2,400. I've got no real issue with 2,400 as a number based off that modelling that was undertaken.
Thank you.
Thank you. My first question about the 2,000 versus the 2,400 has been responded to, but it would be, I'm not sure whether we've been provided with the Becca report, which has taken the step from the extra 20%.
Talk to that if you like. It is in Appendix C of the Integrated Transport Assessment as that memo.
Thank you. And my next question relates to primary evidence in 612. So we're talking about the uncertainty associated with stage 2 and 3 works, which is fine. And then you talk about on the same time as the full build out of Tauriko West of upwards of 2,400 homes. I'm not quite sure why you talked about the full build out at 2,400 homes. Was that intended?
So it's of upwards of 2,400. So I think what I'm doing here, I'm linking the delivery of the stage 2, stage 3 works with being the long-term works that are required to facilitate up to 4,000. So with 2,400 being accepted through the enabling works, then we then have to turn our mind to what works are required to facilitate between 2,400 to 4,000, which is the stage 2, stage 3 NZTA works.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you saying is you don't have a concern up to the 2,400,
Yes.
beyond the 2,000.
Correct. So instead of upwards of, I think it should read beyond. I think would be a better word.
Okay, thank you. And the other one was 813. where you're talking about infrastructure ready.
Mhm.
And again, it might be a matter of just my interpretation. You're talking about sufficient to support the references sufficient to support the capacity. And then you go on to say, in my opinion, requiring sufficient available to support it is more appropriately aligned. So are you saying that sufficient might be that it only provides some of the capacity? Or I'm just not quite sure what your point is. So are you suggesting the policy could be interpreted as being infrastructure available, but it's only going to support part of the activity, or are we talking about something different?
So as currently worded, the policy says that for development in area 2, it has infrastructure available or provided to support the activity. Now, there is already State Highway 9 there, so there is a road available. There is a road already provided, and it's not about whether it's there or whether it's not. It's about the sufficiency of it. And I think if you go back to the original wording of the notified policy, which was that the sequencing plan was infrastructure ready, and that term infrastructure ready comes from the MPSUD and talks about the infrastructure being adequate to service the development. So there was already in that policy a consideration of adequacy. And I haven't used adequate, I've used the word sufficient, but I think the two are synonymous, really, in terms of the issue that we're dealing with. And so to my view is that you have to, in terms of that policy, in terms of how you look at that and how you might look at any proposals that seek to deviate from those, from the provision of the infrastructure, that there has to be a sufficiency question. You have to look at whether it's adequate, whether it's sufficiently accommodated.
Thank you. We're running a bit out of time here, so short answer on this one, if you wouldn't mind. I just want to refer you to the amendment that you're proposing in policy 12.131. Just so I'm clear, this is the avoid development, land use and subdivision beyond 2,400 residential allotments or independent dwellings until transport infrastructure linked to the planned State Highway 29 upgrade is delivered. I'm assuming that the very directive wording that you've put in there is to knock out automatically this second step of 104D and simply to allow the effects issue to move through if non-complying activity is accepted.
Correct, and providing a very clear signal in terms of what the expectation is.
I just want to be clear that's what the intention was. All right. Thank you for that. Mr. Henning.
Thank you. That completes the case for Tauriko Crossing.
Right, Mr. Wood, welcome. And we have you online. And it says live. Can you hear? Are you with us now, Mr. Wood? No. Can you hear us? Any joy yet, Mr. Wood? Can you hear? No? No. That sounded likely. Was that, are we with you now? Why don't we call someone else for it? Can you number the phone? What do you say?
Yeah, no,
Oh, yes.
we're just trying to.
Are you there? Are you hearing anything, Mr. Wood? No? Yeah, hang on, just hang on. Yeah. Yeah. No. No. All right. Just take him offline. Take him offline, and we'll deal with somebody else. Yeah. Mr. Adams, I will just skip over NZTA if you wouldn't come forward. That's fine. We'll sort out what was going on with us, and we'll. Oh, you're here for the Urban Task Force, obviously. Yeah. It should go good.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kia ora koutou, hearing commissioners, ladies and gents. My name is Scott Adams. I'm Chair of the Urban Task Force for Tauranga and Managing Director for Caris. I think you've heard me speak to evidence on other matters before. So, Mr. Chair, if it pleases the panel, rather than reading the whole submission verbatim, perhaps if I just read 7 or 8 of the key points and then answer any questions if there is any at the end. So one of the key outstanding concerns for the UTF is the matter of yield and how that's being dealt with through this IPI variation. My understanding from my involvement with earlier IPI plan changes, including Plan Change 33 and Western Bay's Plan Change 92, is that the plan provisions cannot be more restrictive or less enabling than those in existing city plans. Including the major landowners involved in Tauriko West, and apologies, I didn't hear Classic's evidence yesterday. I was watching the YouTube live stream and it stopped at KO, so forgive me if I'm doubling up on anything, but the UTF membership as well as the Tauriko West landowners include multiple layers of builders throughout the marketplace here that deliver housing solutions in different ways, and they have different abilities to raise or obtain capital, but all of them have said that they'd be affected by a heavily prescriptive yield approach. The whole focus of Plan Change 33 was to enable and liberate building height and density around existing commercial centres and transport corridors to create well-functioning urban environments. As noted by Mr. Collier in his evidence, there's no certainty around any provision of commercial centres at Tauriko West. There's no proposed zone to anchor these and no rules to require them. Notwithstanding the regulatory risk of a complex resource consent process to create commercial centres and the existing competition from the well-established Tauranga Crossing, who I believe you just heard from nearby. There's little incentive for Tauriko West developers to pursue commercial options. There also appears to be a significant uncertainty in relation to provision of social infrastructure for Tauriko West, which is also an important consideration if the council are going to require pockets of medium density throughout this IPI process beyond those in the operative city plan. Clear commitments are required around the funding and delivery of social infrastructure. As identified by Mr. Hill's evidence yesterday, there's significant uncertainty around this. I consider that any density should be delivered in pockets where it makes sense, in locations where the necessary commercial and community infrastructure exists to support a well-functioning urban environment. Terraces or even apartments, they only work in areas that are walking distance to well-established public transport infrastructure, social amenities, and are adjacent to commercial and retail facilities. It's very rare in greenfield urban growth areas that these offerings exist, especially at the commencement of development. My core concern is that if the council regulates to require housing outcomes via a high blanket target yield at Tauriko West, and the market does not demand these dwellings, or they're not feasible or affordable to deliver and buy, then this will only compound Tauranga's housing shortage woes further. Housing supply can be delivered at pace and scale if it's an affordable product that the market demands. TCC must collaborate with the Tauriko West developers on this to set realistic, site-specific targets that align with housing goals and local conditions. This would be a far better way, in my view, of providing the housing supply outcomes our city desperately needs. I asked the panel that the panel consider in its decision-making that if a minimum yield is imposed for Tauriko West, then that yield target should be based on what is currently being achieved in nearby urban growth areas, such as the lakes in Paispa West urban growth area. At the start of that project, former developers Grasshopper went into liquidation trying to deliver medium density lots for housing in the first stage of the lakes, and they didn't sell. It wasn't until some years later, once the subdivision achieved a level of maturity during the post-GFC boom, that the market became more accepting and attuned to medium density zones. And that was driven by the influx of the Auckland buyer market, largely between 2015 to 2019. And this made shared wall housing more acceptable to the market. But even then, this type of housing product only worked in pockets with walkable access to reliable public transport, retail and commercial activities, and quality parks and playgrounds. So the remaining changes which UTF seek are largely dealt with in Mr. Collier's evidence. So that's it from me. In the spirit of moving on, I believe you're currently running behind, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Adams, for that.
Morena. Thank you for your evidence. I just had a question about the Urban Task Force. So you've helpfully attached some letters from developers and builders. Just wanted to clarify, are the letters that are attached are they all members of the Urban Task Force?
Yes, most of them are, apart from one of them. And that letter was sent through voluntarily after the Tauriko West developers went out to a range of builders, because they're also land developers. I'm sure that they'd love to build all the houses themselves, but 20 building companies are better than one if we're going to achieve pace and scale of housing. But I went through the letters, and they've all built multi-unit terrace townhouses, and the key common themes there, I mean, they're all saying thank you for the opportunity, but they won't be buying for the various reasons, and they're broken down between well-functioning urban environment points. What we're talking about here relies on the whole live, work, learn, play philosophy, which is absent in satellite greenfield fringe subdivisions. There was concerns on the limited outdoor space from terrace townhouses, the loss of on-site car parks and garages, which means with thinner roads, you've got cars parking in the street if people do own cars, no garages, reduced visual appeal, daylighting issues, the loss of families and elderly citizens tends to occur as well in these communities, as they're typically 2-bedroom homes, and there's stairs, which our elderly citizens don't tend to be too fond of. Loss of privacy, perceived lack of dwelling quality as well was a factor. but also the risks the implicated risks with this type of development. And one that concerned me as a land developer myself is that came through was the cost of sections must be half the square metre rate of low residential lots. And I'm not sure what the development contributions are for Tauriko West, but they're a factor as well as the bare land, the earthworks, the civils. They just can't be sold at that sort of price that they're talking about, sort of $500 a square metre on a 300 square metre lot is $150,000, and they just can't be built for that. There is a market preference for single-storey standalone homes. I think that came through. Multi-units can't be sold off the plans like standalone homes can be, so they have to be built to be sold, which ties up and constrains the ability to cash flow, and some of these building companies just don't have that capacity. Higher build costs than standalone dwellings. I think that came through in the Flower Day Homes letter, typically about $100,000 more than standalone for the same area, and that's due to compliance with higher building regulations. Scaffolding sits there for a significant period of time, health and safety compliance. So there's a longer outlay with those things, as well as additional structural engineering. There's mid-floors and shared wall specifications, but also the interest and holding costs as the builders and developers have to fund the multi-unit projects themselves out of the back pockets, as banks won't touch them without guarantees. And that was an interesting point too, which I didn't realise, that Master Build Association don't provide guarantees on multi-unit dwellings for loss of deposit or failure to complete. There's no guarantee there. So, and that's what the banks are looking for. So yeah, those letters were quite useful with those common themes all coming through.
We explored yesterday with the urban designer who was with us for Classic regarding what we'd actually heard from many witnesses that were talking about. To achieve 25 dwellings per hectare, there would be 80% attached housing forms. But then we sort of explored with the urban designer what they'd shown on their option, and it was actually showing pretty much a third, standalone housing. A third was lots which were shown as being duplex or zero lot. And then looking at their plans, those zero lot options are actually single level zero lot buildings, so effectively detached single level buildings, and then 1/3 being terrace buildings. On the basis that you're looking at to achieve 25, you're potentially therefore only looking at 1/3 of the site being terraces, not 80% attached, as we've been told. Does that change your view at all?
I personally don't. I'm not opposed to zero lot standalones. However, it's got to typically be on flat land. Otherwise, you're adding cost again with retaining walls and those sort of things. But I mean, I'm a fan of terrace townhouses. I lived in the UK for 6 years. My wife and I were lucky enough to buy a 2-bedroom terrace townhouse in North Sheen, in between Richmond and Barnes, and it was great. We had a overland train station at the end of the road, Richmond Park just around the corner, had Sainsbury's at one end of the road and a bus terminal at the other end of the road. So we did have a car, and it was parked on the street, and made it very difficult for larger vehicles to get through. But that's where I think it works, and that's where my view is pretty firm on terrace townhouses. You've got to build all of that stuff that makes up a well-functioning urban environment for the terraces to work. So if it's a third, then I think the standalones would have to be built first. That's what the market wants.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adams, and appreciate UFT's submission. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. ladies and gents.
Parliamentary IMF, Spatula and Mr. Downing, I think. We're still having some connection issues, I think, with NZTA.
Koto, and I provided the evidence for the panel. I've got Grant Downing with me as well. He hasn't done evidence, but Grant's here to answer any specific questions that might pertain to the land holding. So I'm just going to make a few quick comments and some updated thoughts on the local centre size issue. Just on the issue of target yields, and noted in the evidence that Tauriko West did not oppose the target yield of 25 drones per hectare in order to make any further submissions supporting classics submissions. And at the time the submissions were made, it was generally satisfied that the consent pathway would be appropriate way of dealing with those target yield issues. But as you see in the evidence, we've attended the caucusing, I think it was, and Tauriko West don't oppose the stepped approach, but don't have any expert evidence to offer further than what they've submitted already. One issue I raised in my evidence was the question over why 800 dwelling units is recommended over 1,000 or any other number. And I was pointed to pages 19 and 20 of the 42A report in regard to that. And I've had a look at those. I think the range was provided by Mr. Kimmies of 800 to 1,000, but he didn't set a point within that range. That was left to the planners. And my read of that is that was the lower end of the scale because it would have less negative impact on total yield. However, I was still interested to hear what Mr. Kemi's view of that was, and I noted in his rebuttal that he still refers to the range rather than an actual figure. And I don't know whether he had an input to setting the number within the range. I don't have any expertise to offer in setting an amount, but it was just unclear to me how that was landed on, given his expertise was the thing that generated that range. So that's still a question in my mind. With respect to stormwater management, there's the key issue of concern to Tauriko West Limited is the balance between achieving integrated stormwater management across a number of policy instruments, the district plan itself, the citywide versus the locally specific provisions, the balance between the region and the city plan provisions, and then into detail and the stormwater discharge consents, stormwater consents, and stormwater management plans that are matters of detail, and an overall view that that needs to be carefully managed to avoid creating a whole lot of layers of assessment in different documents. It's an ongoing issue really in terms of finding that sweet spot of integration between all those documents. But overall, the 42A report, in my view, provides a reasonable approach to that. And so my evidence focused on a few specific issues within that wider scope. The Tauriko West submission raised these issues. My evidence focused on those. One of those was the weighting between the citywide and locally specific provisions if a conflict arises. And assuming that the specific overrides the general when there's a contest between those. But I thought it may be better to actually spell that out. And I identified in my statement an issue around the sort of maintenance, the balancing the maintenance issues, and suggested some rewording on that point. The second issue is how stormwater positive effects, objectives and policies might be addressed to create more certainty for consenting. And I just had some difficulty in there. Well, concern was that the words in sort of first reading suggest a bit of an open agenda of how that might be dealt with through the consent process. But reading it more closely, I suggested a way of interpreting it. I was really wanting to seek some assurance that our interpretation was correct and what that was seeking. And the third stormwater issue is in my rebuttal statement, and that relates to subdivision rules for the treatment of riparian margins proposed by the Regional Council. In a general sense, agree with the 42A report that that's probably not strictly necessary. However, with the recent plan change in a very similar sort of environmental setting, these rules were included, and that is a development that Element is doing. So there's a reasonably good understanding of that, and I've put forward some amendments to those proposed rules to provide greater alignment to what was included in Plan Change 35. On the issue of local centre size, the submission from Tauriko West sought an increase to 2 hectares in total area in relation to three things they thought needed to be considered further. One of those was the residential mixed use with at-grade parking, if that was included, the larger footprint commercial activities such as medical centres and preschools, and on-site stormwater management. And in regard to the 42A report and other evidence that the residential and stormwater issues have been addressed, and the issue that remains is the issue of childcare and medical centre activities being located in local centres. And just to note there that those activities are treated as the language is, sure let's check, community support activities in the district plan and city plan. And those community support activities include health centres, schools, places of worship, those kinds of things that are allowed. They're allowed in commercial zones, and we heard that in the evidence from Tauriko Crossing. They're also allowed in residential zones. And the overall point we're trying to make is that it seems like a much better outcome for those, particularly medical centres and childcare, to be encouraged to locate at a centre. And that commonly happens when you look at centres that do exist. The sort of empirical evidence is there. That's what people want to do. It makes sense. But when generally they locate outside the commercial zone, in the residential zone, on the edge. But they can locate anywhere through the residential zone if the assessment supports that. So we were, Tauriko West Limited, looking for provisions that better support that outcome. And the suggestion was made that in my evidence that the GFA limits exclude childcare and medical centre activities. But I've gone back and had a closer look at Mr. Heath's response to submissions. And it was in his statement, he talks about the local centre GFA limits excluding any additional land provision for non-commercial activities as part of a centre, such as playgrounds and transport facilities and community support activities. He doesn't call them that. He calls them something else, but I'm not 100% sure whether he means those same activities that are in the addressed in that way in the residential zone policies. So, my suggestion at this point is to make it clear in the local centre GFA limits what is excluded in line with what Mr. Heath said in his statement. And but in doing that, just to clarify that his reference to, I think he calls them community facilities, whether he means the same thing as the community support activities. He's used slightly different language. The other point I make is that the evidence, I think Aaron Collier's evidence raised concerns about the way that these commercial centres were provided, not through zoning, and some of the issues that came out of that. One thing that I have discussed with Grant is that we do have Plan Change 38 around the corner, which I think will provide another avenue to potentially resolve these issues, and certainly that Plan Change 38 timing would be well in advance of any of these centres actually being developed on the ground. So there is an opportunity to, you know, potentially deal with this concerns raised through that process. And I think the same thing came up with the Plan Change 33 hearings, where there were some issues that were hard to deal with through that process. But I think the Plan Change 38, in my view, provides a bit of a backstop to perhaps get some of these issues dealt with a bit more effectively without the sort of constraints of the IPI process.
And just remind us, 38 is the commercial centres.
Commercial centres strategy, yes. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Mr. Basham. Mr. Downing, did you want to add anything before we go to questions, or no, you're happy? Okay, all right. Anything? No, I mean, the amendments that you've proposed have been responded to by council, and obviously we'll take those on board as well. So thank you very much for the time today. And I should just note, we had a reasonably lengthy discussion on the 800 to 1,000 range issue yesterday with Mr. Keemis and others. I won't spoil the fun. You can watch it back on the recording as to where we got to. Yeah. Yeah.
Stays. Thanks.
Yeah. We're still no closer to getting NZTA on board, so we'll take a morning break until 10:02. Thank you.